Welcome back to Don't Breathe on Me. Today is May 22nd. My name is Abram Hurt.
And my name is Ezra Hurt.
We're two brothers in Brownsburg, Indiana, staying at home for the most part and keeping our social distance.
It's been a while since we've done an episode for the podcast. Since our last episode, I've finished up my school year and will officially be a freshman in high school.
This past week, I submitted my final undergraduate assignment and graduated with 2 degrees from Franklin College. This week, we have a pretty interesting episode to share with you guys. We sat down and had the chance to ask our state senator, Sen Crane, a few questions.
Before we share that interview, let's get started with an update over the coronavirus pandemic.
Sure thing. Indiana continues to be in Stage 2 of its 5-step reopening plan. Governor Eric Holcomb is expected to sign an executive order that will move most of the state into Stage 3 on Friday.
Under Stage 3, gyms, YMCAs, fitness studios, community pools, and campgrounds may open with restrictions. Recreational sports practices can begin, although contact sports like football and lacrosse are still prohibited. Basketball, tennis, soccer, and baseball fields and courts may also open. Gatherings of up to 100 people will also be allowed.
As of Thursday, almost 30,000 Hoosiers have tested positive for the virus, and over 1,700 have died. From CDC data released Thursday, over 1.5 million Americans have tested positive for the virus, and over 93,000 have lost their lives. This week, we interviewed Indiana State Senator Sen Crane. To give a little context, I went to the same high school that Senator Crane's kids attend, Covenant Christian, and I also saw him around the State House when I was an intern for the StateHouseFile.com during the 2018 spring semester.
We had the privilege to learn a little more about Senator Crane and also ask him some questions about the coronavirus pandemic. So let's jump into the first part of our interview.
Today, we're talking with Indiana State Senator Sen Crane. Senator Crane, thanks for being willing to come onto the podcast. To start off, would you mind introducing and telling us a bit about yourself?
Sure, that'd be great. Well, my name is Sen Crane, and I appreciate you guys inviting me to get onto your podcast and being able to have a conversation about some really timely and important subjects. I am currently serving in the Indiana State Senate and was originally elected in 2016. And so we're now in 2020. I'm just completing my first full term in the Senate and have actually thrown my hat back in the ring to run for re-election. So in the middle of the entire COVID pandemic, we're also trying to move forward with a campaign this year, which can be a little challenging sometimes. And then also, one of the big things that I do is leadership development. So I run a number of leadership programs, the largest of which is the Sagamore Leadership Initiative, and it is geared for next generation leaders. Essentially, we're working with young leaders that are ages 12 to 22 and really helping them understand kind of what their leadership platform is, how they need to be thinking about their faith and their worldview, how they need to be observant in what's happening with the culture so that ultimately they can leverage their platform to bring good into the world. And so we've been doing that since 2009, and it's been pretty exciting because we're doing it now long enough that we have a number of our Sagamore leaders who are out establishing their own leadership platforms and really doing some pretty amazing stuff. And so that's really what my big passion is leadership development. And I'm blessed to be married to my wife, Jean. We're actually celebrating this month 18 years of marriage, which we're really excited about. And we have 4 kids, Caleb, Andrew, Mark, and Emma, who the 2 oldest go to Covenant Christian High School on the west side of Indianapolis. And then the 2 youngest, Mark and Emma, go to Kingsway Christian School in Avon. And we've been blessed to be able to have them involved in some really good educational environments that reinforce many of the values that we hold to. And so it's fascinating because your entire kind of approach to the COVID pandemic is very timely, and a lot of the things that we're doing in terms of leadership development is along those same lines, because obviously we live at a time when leadership is absolutely essential if we're going to move forward on any front. And so I appreciate you guys inviting me to be here today.
Great, thank you for that. Something we've been trying to do with everyone we interview is get a picture of what their normal life looked like before the coronavirus pandemic. So what did a normal workday look like for you before the pandemic?
Well, it's interesting. My pace prior to the pandemic was much faster and more condensed. It was constantly going from one thing to the next. And all those things are still happening. But for many people, myself included, the pandemic really just wiped the slate of your schedule. And so there was a lot of space that forced you to have to stop and pause and kind of take a fresh look at things. For me, prior to COVID, my typical day is atypical. And by that, I mean, I am not in any one particular vocation that is a typical 9-to-5 job. I am in these kind of environments where you're always on, right? So take the Senate role, for example. It's not unlike being a pastor. Pastors understand this. You're always Pastor John or Pastor so-and-so, even if people see you at the grocery store in your off time. And it's the same type of thing with being in public life. You're always the senator, no matter where you are. I could be eating at a restaurant, I could be at the grocery store, I could be at a ball game, and people will come up and want to ask me about things, or often will want to offer their opinion about what's happening, and or what more importantly to them, what they think should be happening that's not happening. So there's a lot of unsolicited opinions that are being offered. But because of that, you're always doing a variety of different things. And so it can be a little challenging not having that 9-to-5 where I just kind of put my work hat on, I go to work at 9, and then I get done at 5, and then I go home. I see it as a blessing because it provides some flexibility. Even the leadership stuff that we do, it's an organization that I started and run. And so there's some flexibility there. And so what I end up doing is kind of interweaving a lot of these different things. For the Senate in particular, there's kind of a certain ebb and flow in a given calendar year. What many people don't realize is that in our state legislature in Indiana, we are a part-time legislature. That means we are not in session for much of the year. We're actually only in session what would typically be the first quarter of the year. And because of that, the times when we're not in session, it doesn't mean you're no longer serving. You're just doing all the other things that the session season prevented you from doing. And then you get into the January through March or April season, and it gets really, really fast and busy and chaotic. And so you'll be in a situation where, say I go to the State House, get there at 8 o'clock in the morning, and you'll have meetings all day, but they aren't like an hour at a time. It may be 15 minutes here, 30 minutes there. I might be able to give you 40 minutes. Usually, sometimes it's only 5 minutes, and you're just kind of going from one thing to the next, or you're going to a committee hearing, or you're sitting down with constituents, or you're having a conversation in the hallway with lobbyists, or whatever it might be. And so you have to learn to be very, very flexible, which I don't mind. I tend to be I like my routine. And so this is, let's just say this has helped me grow in some good and helpful ways, but it does keep you on your toes.
You touched on this a little bit, but how have you seen your atypical day change, and what has kind of become your new normal?
Yeah, well, exactly. And I did mention that, like so many people, when the COVID pandemic really started to kind of take root, and especially when governors and other executives in the government were taking the time to make some pretty significant decisions, we're shutting businesses down, and we're shutting down public spaces, and we're moving towards a shelter-in-place kind of approach. It cleared the deck. And it's interesting, your connection to covenant, because right around that time, we were finishing, it was about the second week in March, we were finishing up session for this year, and Covenant had just won the sectional basketball game for the first time in many years. And so my oldest son, Caleb, is playing on the team. And so we're all set to go this next weekend to regionals, and we're all excited about it. You know, Covenant's going to regionals. And then they stopped Indiana basketball. And you know that things are bad when they stop Indiana basketball in our state. And so that and a variety of other decisions then became this domino effect, right? What people may not remember is that weekend also was the NCAA tournament at the college level. Well, as soon as they limited gatherings in public spaces for high school, then it was the college tournaments, then it was the NBA, then it was the Indy 500, then it was Wimbledon, you know, all these seemingly insurmountable objects that we haven't moved in literally decades have been moved and changed, and some of them eliminated completely. Well, as soon as that happened, it changed the entire script. And so I was like everybody else, and I still am to a degree. Obviously, we're moving out of the shelter-in-place approach, but still very much at first going, what do I do with my time? You know, and then the question was, what did I do before? And so it's fascinating because I had a conversation with our kids early on, and I sat down and had each of them take a piece of paper and write down what are the lessons that you're learning through the coronavirus. And one of the things that they all four referenced was, number one, how much we often take for granted, right? Because they couldn't even necessarily go out and go to the local gym and shoot hoops or something like that, or go to the movie theater. But the other thing that really struck me, my youngest, my daughter, she said, I never realized how busy we were before. And that really got my attention because we're trying to do a lot of good things on every front. I'm trying to do good things in the Senate, trying to do good things in leadership development. I do a lot of public speaking and teaching and trying to do a lot of good there. But man, were we busy. And I think it's a cultural epidemic, right? And so now you go from running 120 miles an hour with your hair on fire to being forced to actually come into the pits and just stop without any kind of sense of when am I going to be able to get back out on the track. And that was a major adjustment for me. That was a major adjustment, I think, for a lot of people. And so God used that in some good ways to teach me some things that I've needed to learn. I'm sensing now as we're reopening that we're kind of getting to a point where more things are coming back on the schedule, which is fine, but I want to learn those things. And one of the biggest is the idea of pace, right? We're all pacing. It's just, as any distance runner will tell you, right? You've got to pace. You get too fast a pace too soon, and you're going to burn out before you get to the end of the race. And I think that we are naturally inclined as people, and Christians and non-Christians alike, but naturally inclined to go at a very fast pace constantly. And then we don't have the balance and margin that we need. So God has kind of forced that. He's created what I call my great reset and trying to get me reoriented back to those things. So now my day is spent being able to rest more, being able to do a lot more thinking, right? We all have those times where you go, one of these days when I have some time, I'm going to, and you got this list of projects that you're going to get that someday project, right? Well, someday has come. And so it's allowed me to look big picture. It's allowed me to do some organization personally on some things that I'm working on. It's allowed me to do some organization on some of the organizations that we're involved in, and using this coronavirus really for what we call positive disruption, right? We're all disrupted. So how can I use this positively to leverage it for good in the long run?
I think that's a great answer, and I really appreciated the Someday projects you talked about. I know for myself, I've had a list of books I always wanted to get around to reading, and now I'm actually getting to do that.
So something I thought would be interesting to ask you is how and why you got involved in politics.
That's a great question, right? So it's interesting. I actually come from a very political family, and I have a couple of uncles. They're both passed away now, but they both served in the United States Congress. And one of them served for 35 years in Washington, D.C. in Congress. And he actually ran for president in 1980 in the Republican primary. And that was the first, that was the primary. It wasn't the first one, but that was the primary that Ronald Reagan ended up winning and became president. And so my dad also ran for Congress 3 times back in the late 70s and early 80s. He did not win. But when I was born, this was all happening, right? So I was kind of born into this environment, and we just didn't know any better. And that didn't necessarily mean that I was on this inevitable path towards politics. In fact, I hadn't really planned on it. And oftentimes people would ask me, hey, when are you going to get involved? You ought to get involved in politics. We think you ought to run, which I always view as a very positive thing, that somebody thinks you have something to offer. But politics is hard, and especially if you have a family, it's especially hard. And so it's never really a good time to run. And I politely would turn down people when they would ask, oh, thank you very much, I appreciate that. And I'd give them all these legitimate reasons why I shouldn't be running at that time. And then in September of 2015, I got a phone call from a good friend of mine who called me and said, there's some leaders in Hendricks County that think you ought to consider running for this Senate seat. She said, well, you've probably been thinking about this a lot. And what she didn't know was, no, I had not been thinking about that a lot. I'd been doing a lot of the leadership stuff that we're still doing. And so I didn't say no. I actually said, well, I'll prayerfully consider it. And I'm going to be honest with you two guys. Initially, I was just going to throw up a quickie prayer, be like, God, do you want me to? No? Okay, we won't do it. And I felt guilty about that. So I talked to my wife and I said, we did tell her that we would pray about it. So let's pray about it. So we started praying about it, and I started talking to a few people just to do some due diligence and see if this was something that I really should pursue. And it took us about 6 weeks, and we prayed about it. And then the prayer at that time was, if you want us to do this, you need to make it very clear. And all of a sudden, there was a couple key pieces in my life that began to kind of come together, the puzzle pieces. And so then, just to confirm that this was something God may have wanted us to do, I talked to my wife and I said, well, let's take 24 hours and let's fast and pray. And the prayer now is, God, if you don't want us to do this, please make it clear, because it sure seems like this is something you're leading us towards. And I will never forget, Ezra. I woke up the next day and looked at my wife and I went, uh-oh, I think we're supposed to do this. And so sure enough, she felt the same way. And at that time, what a lot of people don't realize, right, if you understand politics, you get this, but there's the primary election where you're going against people on your own team. So Democrats will run against Democrats, Republicans against Republicans. And then there's the general election when Republicans will go against Democrats and vice versa. So this was a sitting state senator that we were talking about trying to go up against. And normally I would not go against people of my own party if they're doing a good job. And generally I think he was doing okay, but there were some key things that were really important to me and to a number of other people that warranted me seriously considering this. So in our case, it meant unseating an incumbent, which is a very difficult thing to do. And of course, the incumbent has the advantages. And so we had to put together a pretty quick primary. And most people realized that the heavy lifting of the entire campaign would be in the spring. Whoever would win the Republican primary likely would go on to win in the general. Obviously, you don't want to take anything for granted. You wanted to work hard, and we did. And sure enough, we ended up winning that primary by a pretty good margin. And all of a sudden, it was like, wow, we got to run all the way to November. And so we kept going, and ended up winning pretty handily in November. And all of a sudden I was a senator. And I didn't have any idea exactly. I mean, I kind of knew how we got there, but I certainly didn't have any idea what I was supposed to do at that point. And I remember I ended up getting sworn in, which was amazing. It was such a surreal moment. And then when we had the first day of the first session, which we won in November of 2016, and so the first day of the first session is early January of 2017, I was sitting in my office, which a lot of people think your office is some ornate thing, like they have this vision of Washington, D.C. And in fact, some people think I actually serve in Washington, D.C. They don't realize I serve in Indianapolis. But our offices typically are cubicles. And so I'm sitting there at my cubicle, and I had a Bible, and I pulled it out to read two of my favorite verses, Romans 12, 1 and 2. And especially Romans 12, 2, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And I had time on my hands, so that's why I thought, well, I'll just read a couple of my favorite verses. And so I got done reading them, and I looked at my watch, and I still didn't have any meetings to go to. So I thought, you know what, I'll finish reading that chapter. And it was fascinating because I've read Romans 12 so many times, but that was the very first time I'd ever read it as a senator. And there is so much good leadership information in that particular chapter that it really resonated with me. And so I say all that to say, Ezra, that while I come from a pretty political background, I truly never had any personal ambition to try to get this role or any other role. I pursued it because I believe God has called us to do it. And as I told people when we were first running, and I still believe it to this day, I know for a fact God has called us to run. We'll see if he called us to win. And as it turns out, he did call us to win. And so even as we were contemplating running again in 2020, nothing changes, right? It's still the same thing. I know God's called us to run in 2020. We'll see if he's called us to win again. And if he has, then we'll continue to serve. And if he hasn't, then we'll continue to serve. We'll just serve in a different way. And the key thing is to be on mission wherever God's called you. We all have our mission field. Mine just happens to be in politics for this season of my life.
Thank you. You've talked about what your political life was like in the beginning, but how have you seen that change through the pandemic?
Yeah, it's interesting because, well, let me back up and give you a little bit of larger context here, because the Indiana Senate, and I would say the legislature in general, is going through what I call a generational shift. And what I mean is, when I started coming in, it was beginning a little bit before I came. There was this gradual transition of a lot of folks that had been there for many, many years, and now were being replaced by brand new legislators. And of course, that's just a constant, that cycle. But what it meant was, for example, in 2016, there were 10 senators out of 50 that were brand new. I mean, like day one brand new. And that's a huge chunk of the population that doesn't have any idea even where the bathroom is, let alone how to pass a bill. And so that has continued in terms of that generational shift. The reason why that's significant is because all of a sudden you have a lot of established leaders that were holding all the chairmanships and all the senior leadership posts who are now no longer in the legislature. Not all of them, but many of them, which means that those posts are now being filled as well. And so I ended up, by my second year, being the vice chairman of the Senate Education Committee in Indiana. Whether or not I was qualified, I mean, I've got leadership skills, but I'm not a professional educator by any means and things like that. But that was the opportunity. And I try to follow where God's leading. And so all of a sudden, there I am. By year two, I was also the assistant chairman to the majority caucus, right? So We have the majority caucus and the minority caucus. What that means is we have in Indiana 40 of the 50 senators are Republicans. That's the majority. And then 10 out of the 50 are Democrats, which is the minority. So the majority caucus has a lot of influence. And the chairman of that is a colleague of mine named Senator Jim Merritt. And then I happen to be one of the two assistant chairmen. And candidly, you could make an argument that I hadn't been there long enough to be in that kind of role. But the senior leadership saw some things in me that they felt would be valuable, which I am honored to take the position. And the generational shift has impacted that. So then the pandemic hits, right? And at some point, in fact, I was just down at the State House last week, and you walk in there and it's like a ghost town because, like everything else, everybody's working from home. The members are working from home. Staff is working from home. There's only just the absolute bare minimum of staff that are actually on the premises. And we're blessed, frankly, to live in the 21st century, to be able to have access to Zoom and other technological capabilities that allow us to work from home, which would be a lot tougher in previous generations. And so a lot of the work has been able to continue, but it's also forced many people to get very creative in how we do that. So we have meetings with the senators, and we'll get on a Zoom call, and everybody will get a chance to weigh in. We'll do some conference calls and other things like that. I have not done any in-person meetings with senators or others ever since the pandemic started. And yet we've still been able to move forward getting the job done. And our staff has done a fantastic job of working from their apartments or their homes or wherever they are. And so they're able to keep up on constituents and other people who reach out, because this pandemic, one of the biggest challenges, both on the front end when everything was shutting down and even now on the back end as things are opening up, and all along the way, people trying to figure out, okay, what does this mean for me? Are we an essential or a non-essential business? Please tell me we're essential because I don't want to shut down, or we can practice social distancing. Here's how we can do it. Please let the governor know that we need to open. Everything along those lines, to agricultural issues, to the big conversation we're having right now about school and what does that look like. And of course, you understand this, Ezra, being homeschooled, but you have a lot of parents who, like it or not, just became homeschool teachers and were not prepared to have to do that. And so that's created a whole new dynamic. You have a lot of schools that were in a very good position to be able to leverage e-learning. And then you have other schools that were not. And so you have some students, we have students right now, for example, in urban settings and in really rural settings that don't even have access to the internet, which is kind of hard for us to think about in the 21st century, but that is their reality. And so now if education is primarily through e-learning, they're at a real disadvantage. And so as much as possible, educators and other leaders are working very hard to try to help those students. And in some cases, you just can't. I mean, there's just no viable solution. So you have things like that. You have, even as we're reopening, there's already, here we are kind of rounding out the end of this school year, which became really surreal and disrupted. And you already have educators and leaders trying to figure out, okay, what does reopening look like in the fall at every level, right? From elementary to junior high, high school, college, and so forth. You have questions of, teachers that may not want to come back to the classroom, not because they don't love their kids, it's because they're 65 years or older and may have compromised immunity and don't want to necessarily put themselves in a position where they're going to be, contracting COVID. So there's just a ton of different issues that come into play, and we just do the best we can to keep pressing forward. Really, at the end of the day, I, in my role, you guys in your role, even doing this podcast, everybody in their particular role has something to offer to try to help all of us. And this whole idea of we're in this together isn't just a trendy catchphrase. It's a concept that I think we all need to kind of take personally and take seriously and pursue kind of the messiness of collaboration in trying to figure out how we can all move forward together.
That's the first part of our interview with Senator Crane. We really enjoyed that, and we hope you'll join us for part 2 of this episode, which will be released sometime next week. Again, if you have any thoughts, questions, or you would like us to try to talk to an individual, you can send us a message on our Facebook page. Don't breathe on me.
In part 2, we'll ask Senator Crane some questions about the economic impact and how the state has approached the pandemic. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you'll continue to listen to our future shows.